Religious Violence in the History of the Roman Catholic Church, a comprehensive documentary. Throughout the 2,000-year history of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church has been one of the most influential institutions in Western civilization. It has shaped art, culture, philosophy, and the moral framework of countless societies. Yet, like many powerful institutions throughout history, the Church has also been involved in periods of profound violence, coercion, and persecution. This documentary examines the darker chapters of Catholic history, not to condemn the faith itself or its billions of adherents, but to understand how religious authority, political power, and human fallibility intersected to produce some of history's most tragic episodes. The story of religious violence within Catholicism is complex and multifaceted. It spans continents and centuries, from the medieval Crusades to the Spanish Inquisition, from the persecution of heretics to the forced conversions of indigenous peoples. Understanding these events requires us to examine the historical context, the theological justifications offered at the time, and the lasting impact on communities and cultures around the world. Chapter 1. The Crusades. In November 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of nobles and clergy at the Council of Clermont in France. His speech would launch one of the most consequential military campaigns in history, the Crusades. Urban called upon Christian warriors to march to the Holy Land and liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. He promised spiritual rewards, including the remission of sins, to those who took up the cross. The First Crusade began in 1096, and what followed was a series of military expeditions that would last for nearly 2 centuries. The Crusaders' journey to Jerusalem was marked by violence not only against Muslim armies, but also against Jewish communities along the Rhine Valley. In cities like Mainz, Worms, and Cologne, thousands of Jews were massacred by Crusader mobs who saw them as enemies of Christ. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in July 1099, they laid siege to the city for over a month. When the walls were finally breached, the Crusaders went on a rampage through the streets. Contemporary accounts describe horrific scenes of slaughter, with thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants killed. The Al-Aqsa Mosque became a site of particular bloodshed, with reports of blood running ankle-deep in the sacred spaces. The Crusades continued through multiple campaigns over the next 200 years. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 infamously never reached the Holy Land at all. Instead, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and fellow Christian territory. They looted churches, destroyed priceless religious artifacts, and brutalized the population. This betrayal deepened the schism between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity. The Children's Crusade of 1212 represents one of the most tragic episodes. Thousands of children and young people, inspired by religious fervor, set out for the Holy Land believing their innocence would succeed where armed knights had failed. Most never reached their destination. Many were sold into slavery, died of disease, or perished at sea. The impact of the Crusades extended far beyond the battlefield. They poisoned relations between Christianity and Islam for generations, created deep wounds in Jewish communities across Europe, and established patterns of religiously justified violence that would echo through the centuries. Chapter 2. The Medieval Inquisition. In the early 13th century, the Catholic Church faced what it perceived as a grave threat: the spread of heretical movements that challenged Orthodox doctrine. The most prominent of these were the Cathars, also known as Albigensians, who thrived in southern France. The Cathars believed in a dualistic theology that contradicted core Catholic teachings about the nature of God and creation. In 1208, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a 20-year military campaign against the Cathars. This was not a distant war in foreign lands, but a brutal conflict within Christian Europe itself. The crusade was marked by extreme violence. At the city of Béziers in 1209, when soldiers asked how to distinguish Catholics from Cathars, the papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Thousands were slaughtered. The siege of Montségur in 1244 effectively ended Cathar resistance. After a 9-month siege, over 200 Cathars who refused to renounce their faith were burned alive at the foot of the fortress. This mass execution symbolized the Church's determination to eliminate heresy by any means necessary. To root out remaining heretics, Pope Gregory IX established the medieval Inquisition in 1231. This was a formal judicial system designed to identify, interrogate, and punish those accused of heresy. Inquisitors, often Dominican friars, traveled from town to town, conducting investigations and trials. The Inquisition employed methods that would be considered torture by any modern standard. Accused heretics were subjected to sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological pressure. If these methods failed to produce confessions, physical torture was authorized. The strappado, where victims were hung by their arms twisted behind their backs, was commonly used. The rack, which stretched the body until joints dislocated, was another favored instrument. Those found guilty of heresy faced severe punishments. Minor offenses might result in public penance, fines, or pilgrimage. More serious cases led to imprisonment, sometimes for life. The most severe punishment was being relaxed to the secular arm, a euphemism meaning the convicted person would be handed over to civil authorities for execution, typically by burning at the stake. The Inquisition created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Neighbors denounced neighbors, sometimes from genuine religious conviction, sometimes from personal grudges. The accused had limited rights to defend themselves, and the identity of accusers was often kept secret. This system of religious policing would evolve and persist in various forms for centuries. Chapter 3. The Spanish Inquisition. In 1478, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain obtained permission from Pope Sixtus IV to establish the Spanish Inquisition. Unlike the earlier medieval Inquisition, this institution was controlled by the Spanish monarchy and became a tool of both religious orthodoxy and political power. The Spanish Inquisition initially focused on conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under duress. Many Spanish Christians suspected these converts of secretly practicing Judaism. The Inquisition sought to identify and punish these crypto-Jews. Tomás de Torquemada, appointed as the first Grand Inquisitor in 1483, became synonymous with religious persecution. Under his leadership, thousands were investigated, tortured, and executed. The methods of the Spanish Inquisition were systematic and terrifying. Torture was used extensively to extract confessions. The water torture, where water was forced down the throat of the bound victim, simulated drowning and often caused severe internal damage. The Spanish boot, which crushed the legs, and various forms of suspension and stretching were also employed. Public executions, known as auto de fe or act of faith, became spectacles of state power and religious authority. These ceremonies could last for hours, with elaborate processions, public readings of sentences, and finally, the burning of those convicted of unrepentant heresy. The victims wore distinctive garments called sanbenitos, and the events drew large crowds. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed to the Americas, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Christianity. An estimated 100 to 200,000 Jews were forced to leave, abandoning their homes, businesses, and communities. Many died during the Exodus. The Spanish Inquisition expanded its targets over time to include Muslims, Protestants during the Reformation, and anyone accused of witchcraft or blasphemy. It also reached into Spain's colonial territories in the Americas, where it persecuted indigenous peoples suspected of reverting to their traditional religions after forced conversion. The Spanish Inquisition operated for over 3 centuries, not officially abolished until 1834. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, from several thousand to tens of thousands. But the cultural and psychological impact was far greater, creating a climate of fear that stifled intellectual freedom and cultural diversity for generations. Chapter 4. The Reformation and Religious Wars. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he ignited a theological revolution that would split Western Christianity and lead to over a century of religious warfare. The Catholic Church's response to Protestantism combined theological counterarguments with political and military force. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 saw over 100,000 deaths as peasants, inspired partly by Reformation ideas about spiritual equality, rose against their feudal lords. While Luther himself condemned the uprising, the conflict demonstrated how religious reformation and social upheaval had become intertwined. In France, the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants called Huguenots lasted from 1562 to 1598. The most infamous event was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. Beginning in Paris on August 24th and spreading to other cities, Catholic mobs killed thousands of Huguenots. Modern estimates suggest between 5,000 and 30,000 deaths. The violence was often personal and brutal, with neighbors turning against neighbors in an orgy of sectarian killing. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, devastated Central Europe. While it began as a conflict between Catholic and Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire, it evolved into a broader European war involving most major powers. The war was catastrophically destructive. Some regions of Germany lost up to half their population through violence, famine, and disease. Cities were sacked, villages burned, and civilians subjected to horrific atrocities by armies on both sides. The Catholic Church supported the Counter-Reformation, a movement to combat Protestantism through both spiritual renewal and forceful suppression. The Council of Trent, meeting intermittently from 1545 to 1563, clarified Catholic doctrine and strengthened church discipline. But the Counter-Reformation also intensified the Inquisition's activities and supported Catholic monarchs in their military campaigns against Protestant territories. Witchcraft trials, while not exclusively a Catholic phenomenon, were prevalent in Catholic regions during this period. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Catholic inquisitors, became a handbook for identifying and prosecuting alleged witches. Tens of thousands, mostly women, were tortured and executed across Europe on charges of witchcraft, often after being subjected to trials that made conviction nearly inevitable. Chapter 5. Colonial Violence and Forced Conversions. When European powers began their colonial expansion in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, Catholic missionaries accompanied conquistadors and colonizers. The mission to spread Christianity was inseparable from the project of imperial conquest, and the results were often devastating for indigenous populations. In the Americas, the Spanish conquest brought death on an unprecedented scale. While most indigenous deaths resulted from European diseases, violence and forced labor under the encomienda system killed countless others. The encomienda granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities, ostensibly to Christianize them, but in practice creating a system of brutal exploitation. The requirement, or requerimiento, was a document read to indigenous peoples declaring Spanish sovereignty and demanding they accept Catholic Christianity. If they refused, the Spanish claimed the right to wage war and enslave the population. This legal fiction provided a thin veneer of religious justification for conquest and violence. The absurdity of reading a Spanish or Latin document to peoples who could not understand these languages apparently troubled few colonizers. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar, became one of the few contemporary voices documenting and condemning the atrocities. His A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, published in 1552, detailed horrific abuses, mass killings, torture, enslavement, and the destruction of indigenous cultures. He estimated millions of deaths, though modern historians debate the exact numbers. In what is now California, the Spanish mission system, established in the late 18th century, forcibly converted and confined indigenous peoples. Native Americans were required to live at the missions, forbidden from practicing their traditional religions, and subjected to harsh discipline. Many died from disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. The mission system destroyed traditional ways of life and decimated indigenous populations. In the Congo, Catholic missionaries accompanied Belgian colonial forces in the late 19th century. While missionaries sometimes protested the worst atrocities of King Leopold's brutal regime, the Church also benefited from colonial structures and participated in the cultural erasure of indigenous traditions. The residential school systems established in Canada, the United States, and Australia, often run by Catholic religious orders, forcibly removed indigenous children from their families to civilize and Christianize them. Children were punished for speaking their native languages, practicing traditional customs, or resisting assimilation. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse was widespread. The last of these schools didn't close until the late 20th century, and the intergenerational trauma persists today. Chapter 6. The Church and Anti-Semitism. The relationship between the Catholic Church and Jewish communities represents one of history's longest and most tragic patterns of religious persecution. For nearly 2 millennia, church teachings and actions contributed to the marginalization, persecution, and sometimes mass murder of Jewish people. Early church fathers established theological positions that blamed Jews collectively for the death of Jesus Christ. This deicide charge became embedded in Catholic theology and liturgy. For centuries, the Good Friday liturgy included prayers referring to perfidious Jews, language not removed until the 1960s. Medieval popes and church councils imposed restrictions on Jewish communities. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 required Jews to wear distinctive badges or clothing, marking them as separate and inferior. This practice of forced marking would resurface horrifically in Nazi Germany. Jews were restricted from many professions, forced into money lending, and then condemned as usurers. They were confined to ghettos, separate quarters in cities where they could be more easily controlled and monitored. Blood libel accusations, false claims that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, led to pogroms throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Despite lacking any factual basis, these accusations were sometimes endorsed or at least tolerated by church authorities. Communities were massacred based on these fabricated charges. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, carried out by the Catholic monarchs with papal approval, represented one of the largest forced migrations in medieval history. Similar expulsions occurred in England in 1290, France multiple times during the medieval period, and various German and Italian territories. Each expulsion was accompanied by the seizure of Jewish property and the disruption of communities that had existed for generations. During the Reformation period, even as the Church battled Protestant heresies, persecution of Jews continued. Ghettos were formalized and expanded. The Papal States maintained some of the most restrictive laws against Jews in Europe. In the 19th century, as European societies began to modernize and secularize, the Catholic Church often opposed Jewish emancipation and civil rights. Catholic publications spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and stereotypes. This climate of religiously sanctioned anti-Semitism created fertile ground for the racial anti-Semitism that would emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Church's response to the Holocaust remains controversial. Pope Pius XII, who led the Church during World War II, maintained diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany and never publicly condemned the Holocaust while it was occurring, though he did quietly assist some Jewish refugees. Many individual Catholics, including clergy and religious orders, heroically saved Jewish lives, often at great personal risk. But as an institution, the Church's response was marked by caution and silence when moral clarity and vocal opposition were desperately needed. Only in 1965, with the Second Vatican Council's declaration Nostra Aetate, did the Catholic Church formally reject the deicide charge and condemn anti-Semitism. Pope John Paul II made significant efforts toward Catholic-Jewish reconciliation, including visiting synagogues and acknowledging the Church's historical failures. In 2000, he formally apologized for the Church's role in anti-Semitism and other historical wrongs. Conclusion. The history we have examined is difficult and painful. It reveals how religious institutions, even those claiming to represent divine love and justice, can become instruments of oppression and violence when merged with political power and human prejudice. Several factors contributed to these patterns of violence. The claim to exclusive religious truth, when combined with political authority, created justifications for coercing or eliminating those who believed differently. The dehumanization of the other, whether Jews, Muslims, indigenous peoples, or fellow Christians deemed heretics, made violence psychologically easier to commit and justify. Economic and political motivations often dressed themselves in religious language, allowing material greed to masquerade as spiritual duty. It's important to note that these historical episodes do not represent the totality of Catholic history or the experience of most Catholics. Throughout these same centuries, the Church also preserved knowledge, created hospitals and universities, produced transcendent art and music, and inspired countless individuals to lives of genuine charity and service. Many Catholics throughout history opposed the violence committed in their faith's name, often at great personal cost. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s marked a significant turning point. The Church embraced religious freedom, rejected forced conversion, repudiated anti-Semitism, and opened dialogue with other faiths. Modern popes have repeatedly apologized for historical wrongs and worked toward reconciliation with those the Church has harmed. Yet the legacy of this violence persists. Indigenous communities still struggle with the cultural devastation wrought by forced conversion and assimilation. The scars of religious warfare still mark European consciousness. Interfaith relations still bear the weight of historical conflicts. Understanding this history is not about assigning collective guilt or condemning contemporary believers. Rather, it's about recognizing how easily religious conviction can be twisted to justify cruelty, how institutions must remain vigilant against the temptations of power, and how important it is to remember the victims whose suffering was wrongly sanctioned by appeals to divine authority. As we reflect on these dark chapters, we might ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn? How can religious communities today ensure they never again become instruments of oppression? How do we honor the memory of those who suffered while building a more just and compassionate future? These questions remain vital as we navigate our own era's religious, cultural, and political conflicts. The history of religious violence in the Catholic Church serves as a sobering reminder that good intentions, sincere faith, and institutional prestige offer no guarantee against moral catastrophe. Only constant self-examination, humility, commitment to human dignity, and willingness to acknowledge and learn from past failures can help ensure that the tragedies of history are not repeated. Thank you for watching this documentary. May the memory of those who suffered unjustly inspire us toward greater wisdom, compassion, and justice. The Crusades established a pattern of holy war that would echo through centuries. Pope Urban's promise of spiritual rewards for military service created a dangerous precedent where violence could be sanctified through religious authority. The concept of indulgences, where sins could be forgiven through specific acts including military service, became deeply embedded in medieval Catholic practice. Beyond the major crusades to the Holy Land, the Church sanctioned similar campaigns elsewhere. The Northern Crusades targeted pagan populations in the Baltic region. The Teutonic Knights, a military religious order, conducted brutal campaigns of forced conversion in Prussia and Lithuania throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. Indigenous populations faced a choice between baptism or death. Those who resisted were enslaved or executed. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France demonstrated that crusading ideology could be turned inward against Christian populations deemed heretical. This internal crusade was particularly brutal because it targeted neighbors and former friends. Entire cities were razed. The troubadour culture of Occitania, a flourishing civilization of poetry, music, and relative religious tolerance, was effectively destroyed. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade revealed the extent to which religious justifications could mask political and economic motivations. Crusaders who had taken sacred vows to liberate Jerusalem instead looted the greatest Christian city in the world. They destroyed irreplaceable manuscripts, melted down priceless religious artifacts for their gold and silver, and desecrated churches. The violence was so extreme that even Pope Innocent III, who had called for the crusade, expressed horror at the atrocities committed. The Crusades fundamentally altered the relationship between Christianity and other faiths. Jewish communities in Europe faced waves of persecution. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 saw entire Jewish communities destroyed by Crusader mobs. These pogroms established a pattern of Christian violence against Jews that would recur throughout medieval and early modern European history. Islamic-Christian relations were poisoned for generations. While there had been periods of relatively peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange, particularly in Al-Andalus in Spain, the Crusades created a legacy of mutual suspicion and hostility. The memory of Crusader atrocities contributed to anti-Western sentiment in the Middle East that persists to this day. The medieval Inquisition represented a systematic institutionalization of religious persecution. Unlike spontaneous mob violence or individual acts of cruelty, the Inquisition was a bureaucratic apparatus designed to identify, interrogate, and punish deviation from Catholic orthodoxy. This bureaucratization of persecution made it more thorough and more enduring. Inquisitorial procedure violated what we would today consider basic principles of justice. The accused were not informed of the specific charges against them. They were not allowed legal representation. The names of their accusers were kept secret, making it impossible to confront witnesses or challenge testimony. This system was designed to extract confessions, not to establish truth. The use of torture was justified through legal and theological arguments. Church lawyers argued that heresy was so dangerous to souls that extraordinary measures were necessary to root it out. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. Refusal to confess was taken as evidence of heretical stubbornness, justifying more severe torture. If the accused confessed under torture, this was taken as validation of their guilt. If they recanted after torture ceased, they could be tortured again. The psychological torture was often as devastating as the physical. Accused heretics were isolated from family and community. They were subjected to lengthy interrogations designed to confuse and disorient. Inquisitors were trained in techniques of psychological manipulation. They would offer false promises of leniency to extract confessions, then impose harsh sentences anyway. Those convicted of heresy faced various punishments depending on the severity of their offense and their willingness to recant. Minor penances might include wearing a yellow cross on one's clothing, marking the wearer as a former heretic and subjecting them to social stigma. More serious cases resulted in confiscation of property, with the assets divided between the church and secular authorities. This created a perverse financial incentive for prosecutions. Life imprisonment meant being confined in tiny cells, often underground, with minimal food and no human contact. Many prisoners died within months or years of their confinement. Those sentenced to be relaxed to the secular arm knew they faced execution by burning. The church maintained the legal fiction that it did not shed blood, so convicted heretics were handed over to civil authorities for execution. However, this was purely procedural. Everyone understood the church had pronounced the death sentence. The Spanish Inquisition differed from its medieval predecessor in significant ways. While the medieval Inquisition was primarily under papal control, the Spanish Inquisition was controlled by the Spanish monarchy. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella used it as a tool of political consolidation as much as religious enforcement. The Inquisition helped create a unified Spanish identity based on Catholic orthodoxy and racial purity. The concept of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, became central to Spanish society. This doctrine held that those with Jewish or Muslim ancestry, even if they had converted to Christianity, were inherently suspect. This represented a shift from religious to racial categories of discrimination. Conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, faced constant suspicion. Many had converted under extreme pressure during waves of anti-Jewish violence in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. The Inquisition developed an extensive intelligence network. Familiares, lay collaborators, served as informants throughout Spanish territories. They reported on neighbors, business associates, even family members who might be secretly practicing Judaism or Islam. This created a society of surveillance and denunciation. Trust eroded as people feared that any statement or action might be reported and misinterpreted as evidence of heresy. Trials could drag on for months or years. The accused were imprisoned during investigations, often in harsh conditions. Their property was seized at the time of arrest, ostensibly to be returned if they were found innocent. In practice, the costs of imprisonment and trial were deducted from seized assets, and many families were financially ruined, regardless of the verdict. The auto da fe ceremonies were carefully choreographed displays of power. They typically began with a procession through the city. Accused heretics wore sanbenitos, distinctive garments that indicated their crimes. Those condemned to death wore sanbenitos decorated with flames and demons. The ceremonies included lengthy sermons, public readings of charges and sentences, and acts of public penance. Only at the end were the unrepentant heretics led to the quemadero, the burning place, usually outside the city walls. Execution by burning was particularly horrific. If the condemned reconciled with the church at the last moment, they might be granted the mercy of garroting before being burned. This meant they would be strangled to death before the flames reached them. Those who remained unrepentant were burned alive. The process could take considerable time, causing unimaginable suffering. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 was one of the largest forced migrations in European history. The Alhambra decree gave Jews 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave the country. They were forbidden from taking gold, silver, or currency with them. Many were forced to sell their property at a fraction of its value. Some estimates suggest that up to half of Spain's Jewish population, perhaps 100,000 people or more, chose exile over conversion. The exodus was catastrophic. Refugees fled to Portugal, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and other parts of Europe. Many died during the journey from disease, starvation, or violence. Ships' captains charged exorbitant fees and sometimes abandoned passengers at sea or sold them into slavery. Those who reached their destinations often faced hostility and discrimination in their new homes. The Spanish Inquisition extended its reach into the Americas following the Spanish conquest. Inquisitorial tribunals were established in Mexico City, Lima, and Cartagena. These tribunals targeted not only crypto-Jews and secret Muslims, but also indigenous peoples suspected of returning to their traditional religious practices after forced conversion. The Inquisition became another tool of colonial control and cultural genocide. In the Philippines, Spain's Pacific colony, the Inquisition prosecuted Chinese merchants suspected of being secret Buddhists or Taoists, as well as Filipinos accused of maintaining pre-Christian religious practices. The global reach of the Spanish Inquisition demonstrated how religious persecution could be exported as part of imperial expansion. The Spanish Inquisition also targeted Protestants, particularly during the 16th and 17th centuries, when Protestant ideas began penetrating Spain, despite efforts to seal the borders. Possession of prohibited books, including Protestant Bibles or theological works, could lead to arrest. The Inquisition maintained an index of forbidden books, censoring not only religious works but also scientific and philosophical texts deemed dangerous to Catholic orthodoxy. The cultural impact of the Inquisition was profound. Spain, which had been a center of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian cultural exchange during the medieval period, became increasingly insular and intellectually stagnant. The fear of investigation discouraged intellectual inquiry and innovation. The Inquisition's suspicion of new ideas contributed to Spain's decline as a major European power in the centuries that followed. The religious wars of the Reformation period represent some of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 in France shocked contemporaries with its brutality. The violence began in Paris on the night of August 23rd and 24th, when Catholic nobles and mobs attacked Huguenot leaders who had gathered for a royal wedding. The killing quickly spiraled out of control. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of horror. Huguenots were dragged from their homes and murdered in the streets. Bodies were thrown into the Seine River. The violence spread from Paris to other French cities over the following weeks. In some places, local officials tried to prevent massacres. In others, they encouraged or participated in the killing. The death toll has been estimated at anywhere from 5,000 to 30,000 people. The massacre had profound political and cultural consequences. It deepened the religious divide in France and prolonged the wars of religion for another quarter century. It shocked Protestant Europe and contributed to a hardening of confessional boundaries. The willingness of Catholic authorities to sanction mass murder of Protestants and the parallel willingness of Protestant authorities to persecute Catholics in areas under their control demonstrated how completely religious hatred had poisoned European society. The 30 Years' War was even more devastating. Beginning in 1618 as a conflict between Catholic and Protestant princes in the Holy Roman Empire, it gradually drew in nearly every major European power. The war was characterized by extreme brutality toward civilian populations. Armies lived off the land, pillaging towns and villages for supplies. Mercenary soldiers, often unpaid, looted and destroyed with impunity. The sack of Magdeburg in 1631 became infamous as one of the war's worst atrocities. Imperial Catholic forces under Count Tilly captured the Protestant city and subjected it to an orgy of violence. Perhaps 20,000 of the city's 25,000 inhabitants were killed. Much of the city was burned. Contemporaries called it the destruction of Magdeburg, and it became a symbol of the war's horror. The demographic impact of the 30 Years' War was catastrophic, particularly in the German states. Some regions lost half or more of their population through violence, famine, and disease. The war destroyed agriculture, commerce, and social structures. Recovery took generations. The trauma of the 30 Years' War contributed to the eventual emergence of ideas about religious tolerance and the separation of church and state. Witchcraft trials in Catholic regions claimed tens of thousands of lives, predominantly women. The theological justification for witch hunting was laid out in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a German Catholic clergyman. This book claimed that women were particularly susceptible to demonic influence due to their supposed moral and intellectual weakness. It provided detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting alleged witches. The trials followed a predictable and horrifying pattern. Accusations often began with misfortune in a community, crop failures, livestock deaths, illness, or stillbirths. Someone, usually a woman who was elderly, poor, or otherwise marginalized, would be blamed for causing these misfortunes through witchcraft. Once accused, the suspect was arrested and interrogated. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions. The accused were subjected to sleep deprivation, stretched on the rack, or subjected to the strappado. Swimming tests, where the accused was thrown into water to see if they floated, were based on the absurd logic that water, being pure, would reject witches. If the accused floated, they were guilty. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent but dead. Under torture, accused witches would confess to impossible crimes, flying to Sabbaths, consorting with demons, causing storms, killing children. Interrogators would demand that they name accomplices, leading to waves of accusations. In some regions, witch hunting spiraled into mass panic. The Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg in Germany saw over 900 executions between 1626 and 1631. In the Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg, 600 were executed in a similar period. The gendered nature of witch hunting is striking. Approximately 80% of those executed for witchcraft were women. The trials reflected and reinforced misogynistic attitudes deeply embedded in both religious and secular culture. Women who were healers, midwives, or who possessed knowledge of herbs and traditional medicine were particularly vulnerable. So were women who were assertive, independent, or who had inherited property. The witch hunts gradually declined in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as Enlightenment ideas about reason and evidence gained influence. However, the last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe did not occur until 1782 in Switzerland. The Catholic Church did not formally repudiate witch hunting or the theology that supported it until the 20th century. The Spanish conquest of the Americas was accompanied by catastrophic violence and demographic collapse. While epidemic diseases introduced by Europeans caused the majority of indigenous deaths, violence and exploitation by Spanish colonizers killed millions more. The encomienda system, supposedly designed to Christianize indigenous peoples, became a system of forced labor that worked people to death in mines and plantations. Bartolomé de las Casas, who initially participated in the conquest before becoming a Dominican friar, provided devastating testimony about Spanish atrocities. In his brief account of the destruction of the Indies, he described systematic cruelty. Villages burned, inhabitants massacred, children killed, women raped, and communities enslaved. He documented how Spanish colonizers used attack dogs to hunt indigenous people, how they tested the sharpness of their swords on captives, and how they worked enslaved laborers until they collapsed and died. The requirement, or requerimiento, reveals the cynical legal framework of Spanish conquest. This document, drafted by royal jurists, declared Spanish sovereignty over the Americas and demanded that indigenous peoples accept both Spanish rule and Catholic Christianity. It was supposed to be read to indigenous communities before any military action. In practice, it was often read in Spanish or Latin to people who could not understand these languages, sometimes shouted from ships offshore or read to empty villages before attack. The requirement stated that if indigenous peoples refused to submit, the Spanish would make war against them, enslave them, seize their property, and do them all the mischief and damage possible. This would be, the document claimed, the fault of the indigenous peoples themselves for refusing to accept Christianity and Spanish rule. This legal fiction allowed Spanish colonizers to portray genocidal conquest as justified self-defense and missionary work. The missions established throughout Spanish America were presented as charitable institutions bringing Christianity and civilization to indigenous peoples. In reality, many functioned as labor camps. Indigenous people were forced to live at missions, forbidden to leave without permission. They were required to abandon their traditional religions, languages, and customs. Those who resisted or tried to escape faced corporal punishment. In California, the Franciscan mission system forcibly concentrated indigenous peoples into mission compounds. Mission Indians were subjected to hard labor, inadequate food, and harsh discipline. Flogging was a common punishment for minor infractions. The death rate at missions was appallingly high due to disease, malnutrition, and overwork. Indigenous populations in California declined by perhaps 90% during the mission period. The destruction of indigenous religions and cultures was systematic and deliberate. Spanish colonizers destroyed temples, burned religious texts and artifacts, and killed indigenous priests and religious leaders. The Aztec codices, Maya books, and Inca quipus that recorded history, science, and religious knowledge were systematically destroyed. Entire civilizations' accumulated knowledge was lost forever. Catholic missionaries often targeted children for conversion, removing them from their families to be raised in mission schools. This practice of separating children from their communities to facilitate cultural erasure would be repeated in other colonial contexts for centuries. The underlying assumption was that indigenous cultures and religions had no value and must be completely replaced with European Catholic culture. In the Congo Free State, controlled by King Leopold II of Belgium from 1885 to 1908, Catholic missionaries were complicit in one of the most brutal colonial regimes in African history. While some missionaries documented and protested atrocities, the Catholic Church, as an institution, maintained close ties with Leopold's regime and benefited from colonial structures. Missionaries established stations that served as centers of Belgian control. The brutal system of forced rubber collection led to millions of deaths. Catholic missions in Africa often worked hand in hand with colonial authorities to undermine traditional African religions and social structures. Indigenous spiritual practices were labeled as witchcraft or devil worship. Traditional healers and religious leaders were persecuted. Polygamy, ancestor veneration, and other traditional practices were condemned and suppressed. Conversion to Catholicism became intertwined with acceptance of European colonial domination. The residential school systems established in Canada, the United States, and Australia represent some of the most enduring legacies of religiously justified cultural genocide. Beginning in the 19th century and continuing into the late 20th century, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in boarding schools, many run by Catholic religious orders. The stated purpose was captured in the phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their traditions, or maintain connections to their indigenous identities. They were punished, often brutally, for any expression of their indigenous heritage. Children who ran away were hunted down and subjected to severe punishment. Many children died at these schools from disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Mass graves have been discovered at former residential school sites in recent years. Physical abuse at residential schools was endemic. Children were beaten for speaking their native languages, for bedwetting, for homesickness, or for any perceived disobedience. Sexual abuse was also widespread, with perpetrators including priests, nuns, and other school staff. The trauma inflicted on these children created intergenerational wounds that continue to affect Indigenous communities today. Survivors of residential schools describe the systematic destruction of their sense of self-worth and cultural identity. They were taught to be ashamed of their Indigenous heritage, told that their cultures were primitive and their religions demonic. Many survivors struggled throughout their lives with the psychological damage inflicted during their school years. Rates of substance abuse, suicide, and family violence in Indigenous communities can be directly traced to the residential school system's legacy. The last federally funded residential school in Canada did not close until 1996. The Catholic Church's role in these schools was not fully acknowledged until recent years. In 2022, Pope Francis traveled to Canada and issued a formal apology for the Church's role in the residential school system, calling it a disastrous error and a deplorable evil. However, many survivors and Indigenous leaders argue that much more needs to be done in terms of accountability and reparations. The theological justification for these colonial projects rested on a foundation of religious and racial supremacy. Papal bulls from the 15th century explicitly granted European monarchs the right to conquer and enslave non-Christian peoples. The 1452 bull Dum Diversas authorized Portugal to attack, conquer, and subjugate Muslims, pagans, and other non-believers, and to capture their goods and territories. The 1455 bull Romanus Pontifex confirmed and expanded these rights. These papal declarations provided religious sanction for the Atlantic slave trade and European colonial expansion. While later popes would condemn slavery and the Church's position would evolve, these earlier declarations had already provided centuries of justification for colonial violence and exploitation. The damage could not be undone by later reversals of policy. The doctrine of discovery, based in part on these papal bulls, held that Christian European powers could claim sovereignty over lands inhabited by non-Christians simply by discovering them. This legal fiction ignored the rights and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples and provided the foundation for colonial claims across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Its legacy continues to shape legal disputes over indigenous land rights today. The history of Catholic anti-Semitism is long and deeply troubling. The theological foundation was established in the early centuries of Christianity. Church fathers like John Chrysostom in the 4th century delivered sermons depicting Jews as Christ killers and enemies of God. These anti-Jewish teachings became embedded in Catholic theology, liturgy, and canon law. The charge of deicide, that Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, was perhaps the most damaging element of Christian anti-Jewish theology. Despite the fact that Jesus, his disciples, and the early Christian community were all Jewish, and that Jesus was executed by Roman authorities, Christian teaching blamed the Jewish people as a whole for the crucifixion. This accusation justified centuries of persecution. Medieval Catholic councils enacted increasingly restrictive laws against Jewish communities. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, convened by Pope Innocent III, required Jews and Muslims to wear distinctive clothing to mark them as different from Christians. In many places, this meant Jews had to wear a yellow badge or pointed hat. This forced marking served to stigmatize and isolate Jewish communities. The same council prohibited Jews from holding public office and reinforced restrictions on Jewish economic activities. Jews were barred from most guilds and professions, leaving them with few economic options. Many turned to money lending, one of the few professions open to them, since Catholic canon law prohibited Christians from charging interest on loans. Jews were then condemned as usurers for engaging in the very profession to which they had been confined. Ghettos, separate quarters where Jews were required to live, became common in Catholic Europe. The Rome Ghetto, established in 1555 by Pope Paul IV, persisted until 1870. Jews were locked into the ghetto at night and during Christian holidays. Living conditions were crowded and unsanitary. The ghetto walls served as both physical and symbolic barriers, separating Jews from Christian society. Blood libel accusations represent some of the most pernicious lies in the history of anti-Semitism. These false charges claimed that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, particularly in the preparation of Passover matzah. The first recorded blood libel occurred in Norwich, England in 1144. Despite being completely fabricated, such accusations spread throughout Europe and led to massacres of Jewish communities. Church authorities sometimes gave credence to blood libel accusations or failed to condemn them forcefully. While some popes and bishops rejected these charges as false, the Church as an institution did not consistently or effectively combat this dangerous myth. Local clergy sometimes participated in or encouraged anti-Jewish violence sparked by blood libel accusations. The veneration of alleged child martyrs, supposedly killed by Jews, reinforced these dangerous falsehoods. Host desecration accusations were similarly baseless and deadly. These charges claimed that Jews stole consecrated communion hosts and tortured them, reenacting the crucifixion of Christ. Such accusations led to trials, torture, and executions. The charge of host desecration revealed the profound religious hatred underlying medieval anti-Semitism, as it portrayed Jews as so filled with hatred for Christianity that they would attack sacred objects. The expulsions of Jews from various European territories represent systematic ethnic and religious cleansing. England expelled its Jewish population in 1290, making it one of the first European kingdoms to do so. France expelled Jews multiple times during the medieval period, with major expulsions in 1182, 1306, and 1394. Various German territories, Italian city-states, and other regions implemented similar expulsions throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The Spanish expulsion of 1492 was the largest and most traumatic. The Alhambra decree gave Spain's substantial Jewish community just 4 months to convert or leave. This occurred in the same year that the Spanish Inquisition was intensifying its persecution of conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity. The message was clear. Jews were unwelcome in Spain, whether they converted or not. The Exodus caused immense suffering and scattered the Sephardic Jewish community across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Portugal initially welcomed some Jewish refugees from Spain, but then forced them to convert in 1497. These forced conversions created a large population of new Christians who lived under constant suspicion and surveillance. Many maintained Jewish practices in secret at great risk. The Portuguese Inquisition, established in 1536, targeted these crypto-Jews with particular intensity. The Papal States, the territories in Italy directly controlled by the Pope, maintained some of the most restrictive anti-Jewish policies in Europe well into the 19th century. Pope Paul IV's 1555 bull, Cum Nimis Absurdum, established the Rome Ghetto and imposed severe restrictions on Jewish life. Jews were confined to specific neighborhoods, limited to degrading professions like rag-picking, forced to attend conversionary sermons, and subjected to numerous humiliations. In the 19th century, as European societies began to modernize and secularize, many nations granted civil rights to Jewish citizens. However, the Catholic Church often opposed Jewish emancipation. The Church viewed the legal equality of Jews as a threat to the Christian social order. Catholic publications and clergy frequently spread anti-Semitic ideas, portraying Jews as enemies of Christian civilization. The Mortara Affair of 1858 illustrates the Church's attitude toward Jews in this period. Edgardo Mortara, a 6-year-old Jewish boy in Bologna, was kidnapped by papal authorities after a Catholic servant claimed to have secretly baptized him as an infant. Despite international outrage and pleas from his parents, Pope Pius IX refused to return the child, arguing that as a baptized Christian, the boy could not be raised by Jewish parents. Edgardo was raised Catholic and eventually became a priest. The case shocked liberal opinion worldwide and damaged the Church's reputation. Catholic anti-Semitism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries helped create the cultural environment in which racial anti-Semitism and eventually Nazism could flourish. While the Church opposed Nazi racial ideology in theory, emphasizing that baptized Jews were Christians regardless of ancestry, the Church's own long history of anti-Jewish teaching and practice had laid groundwork for racial hatred. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, the Catholic Church signed a concordat with the Nazi regime. This agreement protected some church privileges in exchange for the Church staying out of politics. While the concordat's defenders argue it was necessary to protect Catholic institutions, critics note that it gave legitimacy to the Nazi regime and required Catholic clergy to swear loyalty to Hitler. As Nazi persecution of Jews intensified through the 1930s and exploded into genocide during World War II, the Catholic Church's response was complex and controversial. Many individual Catholics, including clergy and members of religious orders, heroically saved Jewish lives. They hid Jews in monasteries and convents, provided false documents, and helped people escape. These actions were often undertaken at great personal risk. However, the institutional Church's response was far more muted. Pope Pius XII, who led the Church from 1939 until 1958, never publicly condemned the Holocaust while it was occurring. The Church maintained diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany throughout the war. The Pope's public statements about Nazi atrocities were vague and indirect, avoiding specific mention of Jews or calling the genocide by name. Defenders of Pius XII argue that public condemnation would have made the situation worse for Catholics and Jews in Nazi-occupied territory, and that the Pope worked quietly behind the scenes to save lives. Critics argue that moral leadership required clear public denunciation of genocide, and that the Pope's silence suggested indifference to Jewish suffering. The debate over Pius XII's actions during the Holocaust remains contentious among historians. After World War II, the Catholic Church helped some Nazi war criminals escape justice through the so-called rat lines, networks that smuggled wanted men to South America and other destinations. While the full extent of Church involvement remains debated, it is clear that some clergy provided assistance to fleeing Nazis, including men responsible for horrific crimes. This dark chapter further complicated the Church's reckoning with its Holocaust-era record. The Second Vatican Council, convened from 1962 to 1965, marked a significant turning point in Catholic-Jewish relations. The Declaration Nostra Aetate, promulgated in 1965, formally repudiated the deicide charge, stating that what happened to Christ in his passion cannot be charged against all Jews without distinction then alive, nor against the Jews of today. The document condemned anti-Semitism and called for dialogue and mutual understanding between Catholics and Jews. Nostra Aetate was revolutionary in reversing nearly 2 millennia of anti-Jewish teaching. However, implementing its vision required sustained effort. The Good Friday liturgy's reference to perfidious Jews was removed. Catholic education began teaching about Judaism as a living faith rather than a superseded religion. Dialogue between Catholic and Jewish leaders became increasingly common. Pope John Paul II, who served from 1978 to 2005, made Catholic-Jewish reconciliation a priority of his papacy. In 1986, he became the first pope to visit a synagogue, meeting with Rome's Jewish community. In 2000, during a pilgrimage to Israel, he visited the Holocaust memorial Yad Vashem and prayed at the Western Wall, where he placed a note asking for God's forgiveness for Christian sins against the Jewish people. John Paul II also issued a document titled We Remember, a reflection on the Shoah, which acknowledged that the anti-Jewish prejudice of Christians made the Holocaust possible and called for repentance. While some criticized the document for not going far enough in accepting institutional responsibility, it represented an important step in the Church's confrontation with its history of anti-Semitism. Conclusion. The history we have examined is difficult and painful. It reveals how religious institutions, even those claiming to represent divine love and justice, can become instruments of oppression and violence when merged with political power and human prejudice. Several factors contributed to these patterns of violence. The claim to exclusive religious truth, when combined with political authority, created justifications for coercing or eliminating those who believed differently. The dehumanization of the other, whether Jews, Muslims, indigenous peoples, or fellow Christians deemed heretic, made violence psychologically easier to commit and justify. Economic and political motivations often dress themselves in religious language, allowing material greed to masquerade as spiritual duty. It's important to note that these historical episodes do not represent the totality of Catholic history or the experience of most Catholics. Throughout these same centuries, the Church also preserved knowledge, created hospitals and universities, produced transcendent art and music, and inspired countless individuals to lives of genuine charity and service. Many Catholics throughout history opposed the violence committed in their faith's name, often at great personal cost. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s marked a significant turning point. The Church embraced religious freedom, rejected forced conversion, repudiated anti-Semitism, and opened dialogue with other faiths. Modern popes have repeatedly apologized for historical wrongs and worked toward reconciliation with those the Church has harmed. Yet the legacy of this violence persists. Indigenous communities still struggle with the cultural devastation wrought by forced conversion and assimilation. The scars of religious warfare still mark European consciousness. Interfaith relations still bear the weight of historical conflicts. Understanding this history is not about assigning collective guilt or condemning contemporary believers. Rather, it's about recognizing how easily religious conviction can be twisted to justify cruelty, how institutions must remain vigilant against the temptations of power, and how important it is to remember the victims whose suffering was wrongly sanctioned by appeals to divine authority. As we reflect on these dark chapters, we might ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn? How can religious communities today ensure they never again become instruments of oppression? How do we honor the memory of those who suffered while building a more just and compassionate future? These questions remain vital as we navigate our own era's religious, cultural, and political conflicts. The history of religious violence in the Catholic Church serves as a sobering reminder that good intentions, sincere faith, and institutional prestige offer no guarantee against moral catastrophe. Only constant self-examination, humility, commitment to human dignity, and willingness to acknowledge and learn from past failures can help ensure that the tragedies of history are not repeated. Thank you for watching this documentary. May the memory of those who suffered unjustly inspire us toward greater wisdom, compassion, and justice. Please subscribe to this channel for more.